There is a kind of grief that doesn't arrive with tears or collapse. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't demand space. It settles quietly. For many American men over 40, grief doesn't look like mourning. It looks like emotional fatigue. It looks like distance. It looks like a subtle dullness that creeps into life without explanation. And because it doesn't fit the cultural image of grief, it often goes unnoticed even by the men carrying it. This is the silent epidemic. Most men were never taught how to grieve. They were taught how to endure. From an early age, boys learn that pain is something to push through, not something to sit with. Loss is treated as an interruption to responsibility, not an experience that deserves time and attention. So when loss occurs, men don't stop. They continue. They always continue. And that continuation becomes a habit. By the time men reach their 40s, many have accumulated losses that were never fully acknowledged. The death of parents, the gradual disappearance of friendships, divorces that ended legally but never emotionally, careers that didn't become what they once imagined, opportunities missed, versions of life quietly abandoned. None of these losses were dramatic enough to justify stopping, so life moved on. But grief does not dissolve simply because life demands motion. Grief that is expressed eventually transforms. Grief that is suppressed accumulates. This is why unexpressed grief doesn't feel like sadness. It feels like weight. It settles into the body as tension, irritability, emotional numbness, or restlessness. Men often describe it as feeling off, tired, or disconnected without knowing why. They may still function well, still succeed, still provide, but something inside them feels unfinished. And because they don't recognize this feeling as grief, they don't know how to address it. American culture reinforced this silence. Men were praised for being dependable, not emotionally expressive. They were admired for resilience, not vulnerability. Grief was treated as acceptable only in short bursts, and only when it didn't interfere with productivity. A man could mourn briefly, but then he was expected to return to normal. So men learned to compartmentalize. They learned to put loss in a mental box labeled later. But later never came. Responsibility replaced reflection. Duty replaced mourning. And each postponed loss added another layer of unresolved emotion. By midlife, many men are carrying emotional weight they never consciously agreed to carry. This is why unexpressed grief often surfaces after 40. Not because something new happened, but because the internal structure holding everything together begins to strain. The emotional cost of decades of suppression becomes harder to ignore. Men may feel more irritable, more withdrawn, less patient, or less connected without any obvious external cause. They don't feel broken, they feel distant. This distance often shows up most clearly in relationships. Partners sense a barrier they can't quite name. Conversations remain practical. Emotional topics feel shallow or unresolved. Men struggle to articulate what they're feeling because what they're feeling isn't a single emotion. It's accumulation, grief layered on grief. Loss that was never processed has a way of shaping how safe closeness feels. Emotional openness can trigger unresolved pain, so men unconsciously avoid it. They stay controlled, composed, reserved. Not because they don't care, but because caring deeply threatens to open emotional doors they never learned how to close again. So intimacy becomes risky. Men over 40 often confuse this avoidance with maturity. They believe they've handled their losses because they didn't fall apart. But grief isn't resolved by endurance. It's resolved by integration, by allowing loss to be felt, named, and acknowledged. Without that integration, grief changes personality. Men who were once open become guarded. Men who were once curious become emotionally cautious. Men who once felt deeply begin to experience life as muted. Joy feels thinner. Connection feels effortful. Relationships feel less nourishing. And because this shift happens gradually, men often assume it's just aging. But it's not aging. It's emotional backlog. Unexpressed grief also distorts self-perception. Many men reach midlife with outward stability but inward confusion. They did what they were supposed to do. They built careers. They showed up for others. Yet something feels missing. They feel guilty for wanting more because from the outside, their life looks successful. But grief does not disappear just because life turned out fine. You can be grateful and still mourn. You can be strong and still carry loss. You can move forward and still need to grieve what never happened. This contradiction is rarely discussed, especially among men. So instead of recognizing grief, men often label their experience as burnout, stress, or a midlife crisis. These labels are more socially acceptable. They don't require emotional exposure, but they also don't address the root cause. Grief that goes unnamed remains unresolved. Another reason this epidemic stays silent is that many men don't associate grief with emotion at all. They associate it with events, death, funerals, obvious loss. But grief also includes the loss of identity, the loss of direction, the loss of meaning, and the loss of imagined futures. Men grieve the man they thought they'd become. They grieve the relationships that never fully formed. They grieve the emotional closeness they didn't know how to ask for. And because these losses don't come with ceremonies or social acknowledgement, they remain private. Over time, this silence creates numbness, not constant sadness, but reduced emotional range. Men stop feeling deeply not just pain, but excitement, anticipation, and connection. Life becomes functional rather than meaningful. Relationships become stable but emotionally thin. This numbness is often mistaken for strength. But numbness is not resilience. It is unprocessed emotion turned inward. The men most affected by this silent grief are often the most reliable ones. The ones who didn't fall apart when others needed them. The ones who stayed steady through loss. The ones who never made their pain visible. They were too busy holding everything together to fall apart themselves, and no one ever told them they were allowed to. Unexpressed grief does not resolve itself with time. Time only hides it better. What heals grief is acknowledgement, not public performance, not emotional dramatics, but honest recognition. Naming loss gives it boundaries. Silence lets it spread. This video is not about blaming men for emotional restraint. It's about recognizing the cost of carrying everything alone for too long, about understanding that endurance without expression eventually leads to disconnection from others and from oneself. Men over 40 are not emotionally broken. They are emotionally burdened. And until this silent grief is understood for what it is, many men will continue living half-connected lives, functioning well, appearing strong, but quietly disconnected from the emotional depth that makes life feel whole. The epidemic is not that men feel grief. The epidemic is that they were never given permission to mourn. This is Mendecoded, where we don't shame women, don't blame men, and don't avoid the truth. We decode it.